In 1854, the Union Ferry Company, the MTA of ferry boats, announced that all persons who cross the ferries of this company after the 1st of May must pay cash down or deliver a ticket. No more commuting will be allowed. This seems strange. Don't they want commuters? So we looked it up in the dictionary, and this old word commute used to mean a kind of exchange, in this instance, definition number 4, to change one kind of payment into or for another, to substitute a single payment for a number of payments, a fixed payment for an irregular or uncertain one, or a payment in money for one in kind. In other words, travelers would want to pay for their ferry trip later, at the end of the trip, or pay with a sort of IOU. It is not until 1889 that the OED cites the word being used as we use it now, to purchase and use a commutation ticket, more generally to travel daily or regularly to and from one's place of work in a city, using a 1906 newspaper entry as an example that reads, "There are many businessmen who practically divide their time between New York and Chicago and commute, the American term for taking season tickets." We can see in this brief announcement from Union Ferry Company the movement in our culture further and further into a cash economy for working people, where instead of working at home or near home in your own town, the only time you spend in your own town are evenings, weekends, and sleeping, and you spend all your working hours in some other town or traveling between towns. By August 1854, the Union Ferry Company, let's call them UFC, was feeling the heat from raising the fare to 2 cents from 1 cent, and not giving a damn. Their extremely defensive letter to the editor appeared in the New York Daily Tribune, August 10, 1854. The recent action of the Union Ferry Company in advancing the ferriage for foot passengers to 2 cents has proved, as it was supposed it would prove, very distasteful to the public. But it has not been so distasteful to the public as it has been to the managers themselves. Nothing but the necessity which knows no law could have induced the managers to abandon the principles of cheap ferriage, which they were the first to establish and most anxious to sustain, and subject the public to the inconveniences and themselves to the odium and mortification attending the failure of their long-cherished plans. If the public would be satisfied with fewer ferries, with a less number of boats and less frequent trips, with less competent men, and with less substantial boats, then the ferriage might be kept at 1 cent. But if they desire all the facilities, conveniences, and assurances of safety which they now enjoy, they must be willing to pay what it costs. And now for a few facts. It costs $62,638.58 more than was received to run the ferries for the year ending the 1st day of May last, and owing to the advance in the price of coal and other articles, it will cost over and above the receipts at the present rates $50,000 more than last year. Who ought to bear this loss of more than $100,000 per annum? The stockholders or the public? The stockholders receive but 8% per annum for their money, although the leases contain no restriction as to dividends, and as they get no more than a fair return for their investment, they cannot be expected to bear the loss. The public, therefore, must be willing to make up the deficiency and pay for the conveniences which they demand. After all, the burden will not be so great as many suppose. Anyone who chooses to buy tickets can have 16 for 25 cents, so that the poor can be accommodated, while those who choose to commute for crossing at any one ferry can do so by paying $10 per annum or $5 for 6 months. Persons who cross but seldom need be the only ones having to pay 2 cents, and the hardship to say, therefore, will not be great. The managers wish to conduct the ferries as they are now conducted, and to do it at the least possible expense to the company and to the public. They have no personal motives of any kind to serve. They wish simply to serve the public in the best way they can, as they are conscious they have always endeavored to do, and so soon as they find that the receipts of the ferries will justify the reduction of ferrage again to 1 cent, they will be most happy to announce the fact and most prompt to make the reduction one of the managers. 1 year later, the New York Times was snidely chastising the UFC in an article called simply The Ferries from February 7, 1855. The most noble, the Board of Aldermen, by referring 2 resolutions to the Committee on Ferries, have achieved everlasting fame. The resolutions are that the Union Ferry Company be instructed to run a boat from the ferry foot of Catherine Street every 10 minutes from 9 o'clock p.m. until 12 o'clock and every hour from then until 4 o'clock a.m. That the Union Ferry Company be directed to run their boats on the Hamilton Avenue Ferry every quarter of an hour after 9 o'clock p.m. up to 1 o'clock at night, and that they commence running at 4 o'clock a.m. There can be no doubt of the necessity for the above accommodations. Whether the Union Company, one of the snuggest and most self-appreciative monopolies in New York, will concede them is another question altogether. It is at least wildly improbable. The Catherine Ferry has been in a diseased condition for some time, and the physicians of the Union monopoly have tried in vain to restore it to vigor. The remedies have not always been attended with the happiest result, and they have ever been of a peculiar character. For instance, when there were few passengers to carry, there were many boats, running with immense rapidity and elaborate punctuality. Perhaps, like the doctor who used to be called out of church every Sunday, the company thought that the show of business would lead to the reality. When people did begin to patronize the ferry, another original idea was eliminated, namely, raising the fare to encourage them. A blind and obstinate public failed to appreciate this last act of liberality, and the ferry managers were driven to the necessity of devising new means to satisfy their craving patrons. With this end in view, they took off the greater number of boats and run what few they retained as seldom as possible. Strange to say, even this did not gratify the Brooklynites, and the action of the Common Council seems to indicate that something else must be done for them. As to the exiles of South Brooklyn, their fate is indeed pitiable. They are essentially of an amiable and retiring disposition, loving solitude for its own sake, and seeking it in the arid wastes of that strange land. Simple in their habits, limited in their wants, accustomed to the contemplation of death as he threads his respectable way to Greenwood, and asking nothing from the gods but 2 pence for the ferry, they commend themselves peculiarly to the moralist, the philanthropist, the ethnologist. Suffering is the badge of their order, as of Shylock's, and even the heavy dispensation of a Union Ferry monopoly is received with a sad and solemn joy. But like Cain, they find their punishment greater than they can bear. Let us for one moment contemplate their sad condition. Within the past 3 years, a large and populous neighborhood has sprung up south of Atlantic Street, stretching in an almost unbroken chain of dwellings to the bay and city of Gowanus. The most densely populated portion of this locality communicates with New York by the Hamilton Avenue Ferry. The latter is in consequence the most prosperous and best paying of all those leased by the Union monopoly. It follows, therefore, that the company, with its usual obliquity, should conduct it in the worst possible manner. There is no boat in the morning earlier than 6 o'clock. Market carts have to drive a couple of miles out of their way to take another ferry. From 6 a.m. to 9 p.m., the boats run with tolerable punctuality. At the latter hour, one boat is withdrawn, and passengers have to exert an unusual amount of ingenuity to catch the other. It is supposed to run every half hour, But as the company's clocks are regulated by the company, there is necessarily some uncertainty in their movements, and they have become remarkable for differing from all other clocks, and also for differing among themselves. At 12 o'clock p.m. company's time, the Hamilton Avenue Ferry ceases to exist, and individuals who live in the best portions of South Brooklyn have the pleasure of an extended midnight walk to their homes through one of the darkest and most dangerous streets in the city. Until 6 o'clock the next morning, their own one-horse ferry limps not. The modest nature of the resolution submitted to the Committee on Ferries induces us to believe that it is the emanation of an amiable South Brooklynite. All that is asked is additional accommodation up to 1 o'clock in the morning. They wouldn't stay out later than that for the world. And regular boats from 4 o'clock a.m. instead of 6 a.m. There is no complaint of the 2-cent impost, no reference to the distressing limitation of a 10% dividend, no sarcasm about the accruing surplus for the hospitals, no innuendos about private property and Montague ferries, no nothing, in fact, except a meek desire to suffer more conveniently their exile in South Brooklyn.